So, a very warm welcome to every one of you who's joined us today. This is our sixth CIG Services Masterclass, and we have a really international group. And for those of you who are joining at times well outside the normal working day, thank you for making the time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amanda Bucklow, a commercial mediator, and as part of CIG Services, I specialise in accelerated dispute resolution and project negotiation and mediation. And I'm your host for this morning's masterclass. CIG Services is a group of innovative and experienced construction professionals from many disciplines. We rapidly evaluate construction, operational and financial performance to meet project or investment objectives, or indeed to support turnaround. The publication of Global Construction Success in 2019 by our very own Charles O'Neill, to which many of our group contributed, sets out a coherent landscape for the future of construction, not just in the UK, but globally. More recently, Bandit Capitalism, Carillion and the Corruption of the British State by Bob Wylie set out the context for one catastrophic collapse. The industry press reports on new scandals and revelations on a daily basis, and the dispute resolution sector is already seeing a significant rise in construction disputes due to the complexities introduced by the pandemic. Today's masterclass is scheduled to last 50 minutes. After the main conversation, our guests will answer questions for 20 minutes. So please add your questions to the chat. And please let us know in the chat if you don't want your name included in any attendance list. So, are there any questions at this point? Good. Our event today is titled In Conversation, Bob Wylie and Rudi Klein. Bob Wylie is well known for his 14 years with BBC Scotland as a news correspondent. Recently, he was the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the leader of Glasgow City Council for 2 years. Then he was the Media Director with Unite Union in Scotland for a similar period. He now runs his own media consultancy, which frequently delivers on trade union projects, including work with the GMB. He is, of course, the author of Bandit Capitalism, published in September last year. To his delight, the book made number 7 on the FT's Economic Books of the Year for 2020. Professor Rudi Klein was from 1993 until December 2020 CEO of the Specialist Engineering Contractors Group, where he built the profile and influence of a significant group of subcontracting businesses within the construction industry. He's currently a consultant for the Scottish Trade Association Select, and his principal focus is to rebalance the payment landscape for firms of all sizes. The collapse of the construction giant Carillion was not a black swan event. It was entirely foreseeable and widely anticipated by the financial markets and the industry itself. 3 years on, we now have a clearer picture of how devastating the impact on businesses and people, and an understanding of what can be done to mitigate the risks of repeating patterns. So in this masterclass, our 2 very distinguished guests will debate the consequences of the collapse of Carillion from their unique perspectives, as those consequences have played out against the backdrop of the pandemic and indeed Brexit. I'm going to invite each of our guests to speak for a few minutes just to set out the context for their insights and ideas. So, is this a perfect storm for meaningful action to improve corporate governance in construction? And is there any appetite for change? Bob, I'd like you to just set out your thoughts.
Well, welcome to everyone, and thanks very much for taking the time to join the masterclass. This is the book Bandit Capitalism. And it says Carillion and the corruption of the British state. I think that's a bit of a giveaway about the general approach. I suppose I should start with where the book starts, which is with the Russian oligarchs. Now, you may say, or may ask, what's Russian oligarchy got anything to do with the chief executives of Carillion and the collapse of the company? Well, the Russian oligarchs got mega rich, billionaire rich, by looting the Russian state. At the time of the privatization of the Russian economy, where they took over the mineral industry, the oil industry, etc., at rock bottom prices, and then became very rich. As a result, they looted the state. The connection to Carillion is that Carillion, the executives, or the Carillionaires, as they're known in the tabloid press, may be the cousins of the Russian oligarchs because they too got rich by looting the British state. In this case, the British state in the form of government contracts worth billions. 2016 was Carillion's last full set of accounts. They were published in March 2016. They showed that the company had a 5 billion turnover, a £41 billion, they told us, pipeline of contracts. And less than a year later, they were left with 29 million in the bank and went bust, putting thousands of jobs, well, actual construction jobs, about 10,000 construction jobs to the wall, although probably the greatest pain of the Carillion collapse was felt by the supply chain, where more than 30,000 small construction businesses were left out to the tune of £2 billion, many of whom went bust. So the first premise is we have to do something about the current circumstance of exploitation of government contracts by people like Carillion, who are looting the state. One of my favourite stories in the book is about Richard Adam, who was the chief finance officer in Carillion. He left in December 2016 and by May had cashed in shares, his Carillion shares, you know, the long-term investment plan shares that you get for being a director these days, had cashed in shares worth $750,000. He said you could not see the crash of Carillion coming. Nobody could. And if you believe that, you probably believe that the Russian spies who poisoned the Stripples in Salisbury were really there to see the cathedral. But the directors of Carillion's are not the only ones who come under inspection in the book and who are subject to the phrase j'accuse. We could add to them the watchdogs of one stripe or another who are in effect in this story and continuing today to be lapdogs. Let's take the auditors, for example. KPMG, Deloitte, PwC, Ernst & Young, although they like to be known as EY these days, as far as I know, were all involved in the collapse of Carillion and all directly involved in signing off clean bills of health at one time or another for the Carillion accounts or the Carillion dealings with risk, etc. Take KPMG. KPMG were Carillion's auditors for 19 years, and they were paid £29 million for the privilege. There must be something has gone wrong somewhere in Britain where there are 360,000 accountants and only 37,000 GPs. Then there's the regulators, the Insolvency Service, the Financial Conduct Authority, the FRC, the CMA, the Financial Research Council, and the Pensions Regulator. Now, in the context of today's discussion about what has to be done, one of the precepts must be Why is it that the entire regulatory industry, the entire framework in the UK seems only to arrive after the catastrophe? There doesn't seem to be a mechanism which provides for intervention when things are going wrong. Add to that the possibility that, well, I suppose that there's been some action taken against the Carillion directors at the very last gasp, but over 3 years, none of these regulators, with the exception, as I say, of the FCA, have made considerable reports about Carillion or have taken action. So how do we get to the position where the regulatory framework is not in a position to do anything about a collapse of a major company which does government contracts after 3 years? The House of Commons Select Committee, the Joint Committee of the Work and Pensions Committee and the Business Committee produced a very thorough, substantial, seagoing report on Carillion by May 2017. That is to say 5 months after the collapse. So we've got what might be called, one way and t'other, the chaps investigating the chaps and most of the time finding little cause for anything to be done to anybody. To sum up, what we've got here is, I suppose, in the shape of the Carillion book, we've got chief executives who are trousering millions, which they're not entitled to in terms of the wealth creation they're involved in. We've got auditors who permanently look the other way. And we've got regulators who do too little, too late, and frequently do nothing. However, in closing, I should say, the book is not solely about bandit capitalism. It's not solely about Carillion. It also looks at the structure of British capitalism, today's British capitalism, and raises issues about where we are now and what needs to be done. We have a circumstance in Britain where the workshop of the world has become totally owned and controlled by rentier capitalism, which in effect is a contradiction of the motor force of capitalism. Rentier capitalism exists in the shape of private equity, or you name it, to extract wealth and not to create it. So we may have a short-term discussion now about what's to be done with Carillion and the like, but the broader discussion is actually the maximisation of shareholder value as the totem of all British capital's motivations and whether that's right. And indeed, if things don't change, then things will happen.
Thank you, Bob. Rudi, would you like to set out your sort of the landscape for your insights and ideas?
Yes, thank you, Amanda, and good day to everybody. I think the interesting thing about what Bob said there was when he used the word looting. And I like that word looting because what happened also was that Carillion looted its supply chain. But of course, that's not only a failing, or was a failing of Carillion, it's a failing, of course, of many of the large companies in the UK construction industry at present. And that looting went on for some years. And I often had to sometimes deal with that by advising firms on how best they could address this. By and large, firms that dealt with Carillion were simply too afraid of this wildebeest of a company that they just simply never complained. And they lived, I would say, in the depths of fear that if they complained, that's it, all their work would be cut off. It was no surprise when they went bust. And I have to say the analysis in Bob's book is actually excellent and it was absolutely fascinating. But it was simply no surprise. 6-7 years before they went bust, they were selling off their property assets. They then leased back some of these assets, such as their Wolverhampton head office, to continue to headquarter the company's business. In 2012, I think it was, when David Cameron announced the Supply Chain Finance Initiative. This was the initiative whereby if you wanted to get paid earlier, then as long as you paid a fee, you could get paid earlier by taking money from a bank, from Carillion's bank, for example. So when that came out in October 2012, Carillion was cock-a-hoop, because at that point, they were getting extremely worried about the fact that the government was going to push forward with project bank accounts when the money wouldn't pass through them. So they were able now to set up the Supply Chain Finance Initiative as their savior. But of course, pretending that this was their effort now to save their SMEs in their supply chain. And of course, what they did, they then extended their 65-day payment period to 120 days. And then said, well, if you want to be paid earlier, pay a fee. And of course, the greater the amount that people wanted to be paid in advance, then the greater the fee that they had to pay. So they would go to Carillion's bank and get their money if they want to be paid early in 120 days. Quite often, the 120 days, in fact, also went over. I remember one firm calling me up once saying they had 179 days. So this went on. Government was aware of this. Government knew all about this. Government did nothing. In fact, government and most major public sector procurers really just knew what was going on. They just chose to turn a blind eye to it. I mean, when Carillion declared their first profits warning in July 2017, after that, £1.9 billion worth of public sector work was awarded to them. And I remember being shown letters from some of their suppliers which said, these are letters from Carillion saying, look, all these people now are favouring us with their work. You've got nothing to fear. And on the back of that, a lot of these suppliers, they continue to work for Carillion. So it was this almost unforgivable looting of the supply chain, which was described by the Business Select Committee in their inquiry as an approach that Carillion adopted, which was amounted to contempt for their supply chains. But this didn't seem to make any difference, and on they went. I remember getting letters which were to the effect, look, we've been dealing with Carillion over many years. We're a small firm. They paid us initially, and then they slowed their payments down and down and down and down. We were dependent for them on quite a fair bit of our work. And then eventually we went bust. They just bought our assets up cheaply. It was roguish behavior in every single way. But I think today is, whilst we can probably talk a lot about the analysis, but I think it's Bob Wright says, the question really now is where we go from here. Maybe, Amanda, that probably is a good point for me to pause.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rudi. I think what I'd like to ask you to answer now, maybe Rudi, you can start with this, is that both of you have very ably set the scene of what happened, and a lot of people on this call will have heard, some of that before. Can you talk to any activities that are going on now that give you any hope that people do have an appetite to change in the places where they can actually make change? So what do you see by way of effort to learn the lessons?
Thank you, Amanda. Yes. What we've seen since Carillion are probably about 15 to 20 reports with different recommendations. But all these recommendations boil down to the same, that we're not managing risks as we should. We're not engaged in the supply chain as we should. And we there's a lot of talk. The construction playbook came out recently. There's nothing new in this. That these words, collaboration, appear on almost every other page. But the point is, we can't get to the reality of collaboration unless we get over a traditional procurement process that really is about promoting hierarchical structures, fragmentation, and contracts that exist in silos that you simply cannot then talk to anybody else other than your other party. So we are reliant still for probably the largest swathe of our construction on this traditional procurement approach, which has been castigated time and time again. Even the business department, 6 or 7 months after the Carillion collapse, was saying, well, the construction business model is not sustainable. And the Treasury said that for a long, long time. We've just, I don't know if anybody listening in has read the recent green paper on transforming public procurement. This is about replacing the EU regulations that we've had since 2014 or 2015, the public contracts regulations. Well, that probably, that green paper and the proposal they make is a lot better, I would suggest, than the EU regulations. But there's one thing that is missing out of it. And the one thing that's missing is that all this business about fairness and transparency and openness and so on only applies at the tier 1 level. It doesn't spread down into the supply chain. The EU regulations never went down into the supply chain. And those EU regulations were supposed to be underpinned by fair competition, by good practice, and so on. It seems that's only appropriate for the top level. So I don't have a great deal of hope, Amanda, to answer your question. What we have to do is to get out of this embedded mindset that's been there for a long, long time as a tremendously uphill struggle. And the only way we can do that is we've got to drive, and there has to be a proper resource, perhaps, I mean, it has to be established by government, a proper resource that actually is about driving radical change in the industry. There are people, and I think people listening in here and watching, who know what I'm talking about, but there's been efforts on the part of a few of us, and many of those are listening, are those people who have tried in their own way to effect change. One of those things, initiatives I've been particularly involved with and promoting is insurance-backed alliancing. Now, we've been doing that for quite a time now. In fact, I was actually on a committee chaired by Sir John Egan 20 years ago that recommended this. We finished our first pilot project on this about 3 years ago, extension to Dudley College in the West Midlands. And this insurance-backed alliancing is about teamworking, getting rid of all that segregation, fragmentation I was talking about earlier, bringing people together in true and genuine collaboration. And it is working, but getting government to pick up these kind of things and run with them is an uphill struggle. And the difficulty, we do things because we do things very often because it's easy to do them. Amanda, can I just, if I may, add one thing which I probably would have liked to add earlier, but I think it's probably germane to any discussion. There is a lack of, and Bob made this point, a lack of accountability of people making these decisions about taxpayers' money, huge swathes of taxpayers' money. When the two hospitals, the two Carillion hospitals, the Royal Liverpool and the Midland Met, both those hospitals are still yet to be completed. They're costing the taxpayer millions to complete. Yet the chief executives of the two trusts involved are not accountable for anything. When Rory Stewart was prisons minister after Carillion, he said, we knew Carillion underbid by 75 million on the maintenance contract for the prisons, but who has been made accountable for these decisions? And accountability, whatever we do, accountability really has got to be the centre of what we do, and that's all about governance, of course.
Well, thank you, Rudi. If I can ask Bob to perhaps pick up a couple of your points from his point of view.
Rudi knows much more about this than I do. And I should say to the listening audience that I come here as a journalist who has told a story. I suppose from a very small perspective, I have some hope, partially because of what has happened in my own experience with the book, in the sense that CIG Services, which is this grouping of people in construction who have vast experience, who have come together to inspect, inquire, and chart a way forward out of the current abyss that construction is faced with, have adopted Carillion as a kind of case study that should be used in the industry. So from that point of view, the willingness of people, or a certain amount of people, to get together and recognise the problem and then begin to create some sort of structures or approach the structures that have power to do something about it, it is cause for hope. Not all have abandoned ship, one might say. However, Rudi did say in his remarks there that he was on the Latham inquiry, which was 1994. Then we had the Egan inquiry in 1998, and more recently the Farmer inquiry, which was, I think, 2016. Now, those reports, all, particularly the Farmer report, make very cogent recommendations about what needs to be done in the industry, about payment structures, about accountability, about the role of a powerful investigative, what would you put, like, you know, the role of a regulator which is given sufficient resources and power to do what needs to be done. But I don't think we can underestimate the scale of the abyss. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority has within its sphere of operation what's called the, I've got the note here, the Government Major Projects Portfolio. And CIG Services, in its reply to the Green Paper consultation, points out that the most recent report of the government's major projects portfolio suggests that out of 125 major projects, all worth in total 448 billion, there's really only a handful that they're confident can be completed successfully. 34 of those are 125, although my producers in my days at BBC always used to say, speaking statistics is not a good idea, Bob, going to stop doing it. But in any case, 134 projects, only 3 are headlined as likely to be definitely achieved, and an additional 25 are probable. There is therefore a host who don't look as if they're going to make it, which includes the current elephant in the construction industry room, which is HS2. It started life costing us 17 billion. That was revised to 32 billion. That then became 58 billion, then 88 billion. And the current figure, only to get us to Birmingham from London, is 106 billion to those who are in the know. We simply can't go on like this. Something has to be seriously done about the scale of the abyss that we are confronted with.
So, Bob,
you know, I'm a journalist, so I'm prone to exaggeration, as people would say. But I think the British construction industry is on the edge of a very, very serious precipice.
And Bob, do you think that those problems specific to the British form of capitalism, or do you think that that could happen elsewhere in Germany, say, for example? And this is a question that's been put in the chat from Bruce Bagley. So is this British, or is it something much bigger than that?
Well, I mean, even a prima facie inspection of all of this, as a result of being involved with CIG, I've had, discussions with a number of people who are in the orbit, including leading construction advisors and agents in the US and in Germany. And there is definitely not the same scale of chaos, corruption, and being on the take in other parts of Europe, and in particular, Germany in particular, I think suggests is a very important model, where things are regulated to a much greater degree, and where there is much more investigation at the front end of the project about costs, how it's going to be done, add-ons, likely issues, etc., etc., etc. Whereas the British system, it seems to me, although there are more people on this table able to comment about that than me, but the British system, it seems to me, is get the contract out, get it signed, let's get started, we'll see what happens. And that's why HS2 currently is 106 billion instead of an original quotation of 17. So there needs to be much more in the British system introduced, in my view, about a proper start and a regulated start and how that is done. And secondly, although there are variations in this, the British system, the report Rudi referred to made this point. The British system, as a result of what is a government policy, almost always refers to the lowest cost. Now, I know there are other elements taken in contracts. But one of the reports said that the British system was culpable for disasters like Carillion because of this total adherence to the lowest cost bid.
So in terms of change and the appetite for change, and I'm going to ask you this too, Rudi, and Bob, if you could just give a couple of examples. People do put their head above the parapet and they do try and change the model. Both of you mentioned that the business model is effectively unsustainable. So what needs to happen, or what has happened? Can you give examples where people have actually put their head above the parapet and tried to make major change?
No, you go first, Rudi.
No, I was just going to say that I've already mentioned, Amanda, insurance-backed alliancing, which is an initiative that has been around a long time, but it's only very recently that those involved have been able to get projects to pilot, but that's been because of their own efforts, not necessarily because of government support. I remember some years ago trying to work with those involved in this to get the Ministry of Defence or the Defence Infrastructure Organisation to put forward a project to pilot this. And the whole idea is that you get the team working together to agree on the solutions. You don't start construction until, in fact, you've actually agreed what how you're going to manage the risks, the financial risk, the technical risks. Then once that's been done, then an insurance company will then insure the cost plan. So it's the policies are financial loss policies. The cost plan is insured, but to be insured, the cost plan, the insurer has to be satisfied that the approach to risk has been robustly carried out, and therefore they appoint technical and financial insurers to make sure that is done. And that is an example of an initiative that struggles to get public sector support, but potentially it could save up to, on projects, up to 15 to 20% of project costs. I mean, the first pilot was done at Dudley that saved about 6.5% of project costs. It got a performance A rating, energy rating. It was finished ahead of time because it had to be finished before the start of term. It was finished well ahead of time. The objectives set for the project in terms of energy consumption so on, have so far all been met. So there is an example there of something that's quite radical, very, very different, but lacking any well, I wouldn't say interest, but certainly lacking any active and proactive support from government, which is strange because it's what we're trying to do here is to save money. We are one of the costliest construction industries in Europe. It's much more costly to build in Europe than it is in this country.
One question that comes to mind for both of you in terms of your different perspectives, and it has actually been put forward by Graham Clark. Why is the UK government so reluctant to regulate, and I add legislate? Why is that when it's so clear, so many reports that have been paid good money for, and there's still no action?
Were you going to go on this one, Bob?
Yeah. Actually, when I was listening to Rudi there, sorry, my son, my grandson. Sorry about that, Rudi. When I was listening to Rudi, I'd actually written down why and put a circle around it. Now, why?
You know what? I came home and I thought, well, I'll just try it, but doing it. Well, you know, they're thinking, I can't move my back at all. I've been cheating all this time. So,
but sorry, just hang on a second. Somebody not muted.
Somebody was on the.
Stop now.
Well, in order to put that into some sort of perspective, in the construction industry, one of Rudi's many, many campaigns, but one of them has been about if you're on a government contract, if you're bidding for a government contract, you have to agree to the setting up of a project bank account so that all the people who are working and need to be paid have a guarantee of being able to get the money they owed, and there is a transparency about the financial state of the project. Now, he has tried to move heaven and earth. He's probably been on more government committees about this than I've had rounds of golf, and I've had a few. And yet, that small reform, it is still remaining to be done. No action's been taken. If you look at the pensions issue within business, why is it, if you take the Carillion example, that the chief executive and the chief finance officer in the last year of Carillion had £1.8 million paid into their own private pension funds by the company? This at a time when the company had a deficit on its pension funds for its workforce of £990 million. Now, that isn't rocket science. Surely that it's possible to legislate that a private company can't pay into its executive pension funds if, number one, it has a pension deficit over X million, and number two, has not agreed a plan to do something about reducing the pensions deficit to the workers. Instead, the Carillion CEO and CFO walk away with huge pensions, not a hair on their head disturbed, And the taxpayer has been landed with a bill for recuperation of something of the order of 2.4 billion. So it is very easy to be pessimistic because there are simple things that could be done, far less the transformation of the entire industry, which seemingly the powers that be can't get around to doing anything about. I don't know what Rudi thinks about that, but that's what appears to my journalist's eye.
Yes, I mean, on Amanda's question, I think that's a very good question, and others in the audience may well have a view too. It's a combination of factors. Getting government to actually come together to act in unison on one or two particular things, the trouble is that as we all are aware, government is not a uniform organization. There's just so many bits of it. And the problem is, if you just look at construction, for example, and infrastructure, look how many agencies and government departments have a role in that. Well, almost every government department, every agency has a role in that. There's nothing there that brings it together. And that is a major problem. And unless we have policy making coming more and more from a central position, then devolved as it is, I'm talking about construction policy and procurement policy. Unless we have that from the centre, then we're not going to really make a lot of progress. I mean, my view is that what is needed is something Singapore did in about 2012 or thereabouts. They set up something called the Building and Construction Authority. This was a statutory body. Now, I know Singapore is a much smaller jurisdiction than ourselves, but they set up this body, statutory, and the whole purpose of this body, which has a number of different legs, is to drive improvement in Singaporean construction, and that they've done, but with particular regard to the interests of SMEs that form the bulk of the industry. The trouble is that governments over the years here have paid too much attention to the Carillion type of companies, the large companies, and they've tended to ignore the supply chain. They think the construction industry is these large companies. And the other thing that seems to be fairly common of late is that governments will consult on everything now. However major, however minor the issue is, they will consult on everything. But then nobody knows what they do once they've got all the responses in. How do they analyse them? People lose, in fact, track of what's happened because very often nothing ever happens. We had a consultation on retentions, for example, the abuse of retentions. By the way, we still don't know how many retentions or the amount of retentions lost in the Carillion collapse. We think it's about $500 million, which is very extraordinary. But we had a consultation on the protection of retention monies. That closed, interestingly, in January 2018. Now, that's over 3 years ago. Nothing's been done. So this is an area, this is the problem, which is it's a major source of abuse for the majority of firms in the industry, but we've done nothing. Things like that, you don't have to do anything big. The small things matter as well, but it's the lack of any centralized policy-making, decision-making process that's also is responsible for accountability. My own view is that there should be, I believe, as Bob was saying, there should be a regulatory authority that drives improvement. There should be an ethics code, a bit like the Grocers Code Adjudicator that has an ethics code. The Grocers Code Adjudicator can actually impose up to 1% of supermarket profits as a penalty for bad practice. So, if you're Tesco, that could mean about, you're paying out £7 million if you in fact transgress against this code. So the things that can be, we've got the solutions. It's the will, it's the drive. And I think this is one of the good things about the CIG services group that we have here. Very able people, very experienced people who can actually, I think, help to hopefully over the longer term get some change.
So before you respond to that, Bob, a couple of things on that I need to address. That we are slightly over time, but we did start a little bit late due to techie problems. I am recognizing that. Will continue. If people do have to leave, then totally accept that. I hope that's not the case. And the second thing is that there's a comment here, which I think is probably worthy of just a comment or two. It's from Graham DeRoy, and he says, the government, they've had 10 construction ministers in 12 years. That would tend to indicate that it's not interested in construction. And another one from Keith Kirkwood here, the problems arise from a lack of governance and due diligence. UK do not fine or imprison directors who fail to operate proper governance. Should the government legislate to make prosecution easier? I mean, you know, I said, if I just say, if you're an executor of a will, you're on the hook for life. But if you're a director of a company, you're not.
Well, it's interesting, Amanda, that question, I think, because you have a lot. We are, it's not that we're short of regulations, by the way. But what we're lack of is any effective means of enforcement.
Yeah.
They're no good, are they?
Sorry?
They're no good. They pay for the
if they're not enforced, the Companies Act, the 2006 Companies Act, Section 172 says, you know, directors of public companies must have regard to their, not just to their shareholders, but to their workers, to their supply chains. But how is that enforced? How is that monitored? There's nobody to do that. There is a requirement in the public contracts regulations of 2015 that there's a statutory duty in all public authorities to make sure the supply chains are paid in 30 days. How is that enforced? There's no enforcement mechanism for that. Grenfell, we've seen that you know, the whole regulatory environment around building and building safety, that was not being enforced as effectively as it should have been, and this is a major problem. And of course, they will say, if you talk to government about it, well, we haven't got the resources, we don't have sufficient resources. And then all of a sudden, they start, when there's a big hoo-ha about it, unfortunately, it takes a tragedy sometimes to do this. All of a sudden, yes, we'll introduce the Building Safety Act, and we'll have a building safety regulator. And that regulator will have powers, effective powers to deal with lack of any proper approach to managing safety risks. So, you know, but sometimes it takes that. But unfortunately, you know, we don't seem to be able to address these issues otherwise.
Okay, well, 2 points there. Bob, did you have something to say there? Because I've got a couple of really good questions here.
Well, very briefly, I think there is, Rudi's right on the money, which is, there isn't a shortage of regulation and law. There is a shortage of getting something done about the law being broken. So that's a problem. And we have all this, that statement about there's been 10 construction ministers. Time and time again, you know, it seems as if the governments of the day, and this includes those of the current government and previous governments, assemble orchestras on these issues which never actually play a note. And that is, I suppose, for the whole seminar, that is the critical question. Why did nothing happen?
I have a comment question here from Richard Bayfield, and he is part of CIG Services. His questions about ethics, and he is declaring an interest in so much that he's leading a group at the Institution of Civil Engineers reviewing the subject of ethics. So as a chartered civil engineer, the Institution of Civil Engineers places a duty on him, Richard, to behave ethically. In effect, the duty to behave honourably. In modern words, to do the right thing. At its most basic, it means that ICE members should be truthful and honest in dealings. As this is a matter of professional conduct, I ask for yours, that's you two gentlemen, your view on the sanction for senior professionals working at director level when the necessary inquiry into a business collapse finds individuals who were not truthful and honest. Should the professional institution, be it engineers, accountants, or whatever, suspend or close membership in these circumstances?
I would, yes, I would agree with that. I don't think, though, it will necessarily allow for a fundamental difference in what's going on, but it will help, certainly. I think certainly as far as constructions, because I mentioned earlier that I do believe in the fact that we should have a code of ethics, and that should have statutory underpinning. It should be administered by a regulator. I go back to that Grocer's Code Adjudicator Act of 2013 that I referred to. That is one of the. It started off badly because it was poorly resourced, but the Grocer's Code Adjudicator now, she's got rather more resources, and the big supermarkets do not like her carrying out an investigation. They're quite frightened of the powers she does have. So to me, that is a model that seems to work, that we could look at. But I think always the trouble is if you suspend people from professional institutions, which my own institution of the bar, I mean, that suspends, that expels members of the bar fairly regularly for misconduct. That should obviously be the case through every single profession, I would have thought anyway. But it seems to be that sometimes that some of the professional bodies actually do not pay enough attention to this. And I think they should pay a lot more attention, particularly when it comes to construction poor behavior. We see a lot of examples of this, for example, in adjudication, in dispute resolution. Probably you see it, Amanda, in mediation as well, where you've got professional people acting in a way which is wholly inappropriate to their profession. And you're almost, but who's going to report it? This is the problem. Then somebody's going to report that. It falls on like yourself or anybody else affected by this to report it. And sometimes people are a bit fearful of doing that in case of libel and so on.
Okay, so a question to both of you. And this is my question. I've got a couple more from people in the audience, but this is my question. If after the investigations into the Carillion directors, were they to result in criminal prosecution and prison sentences, do you think that would make a difference at all to the way people behave?
Shall I give Bob the
I think undoubtedly it would. I mean, to use the Carillion example, there's a quotation in the book where one of the whistleblowers talked about Richard Adam, and this was a senior figure in the operation. Richard Adam was the CFO, and he said, Richard Adam was a numbers man. And if you took the numbers to him and he didn't like them, you had to change them. So within the structure of Carillion, people knew the books were being fiddled. People knew. People knew that the pipeline of 41 billion wasn't true. People knew that the idea that the turnover of 4 billion was generating billions of profit, people knew that wasn't true. Yet that went on and on. People knew that the figures were changed. People knew that the directors did not, under the Pensions Act, fulfil their obligations to the workforce about the pensions payment. People knew, to use Rudi's example, that after the first declaration of the hole in the books amounting to 845 billion, people knew that Carillion then put out notices in the industry to say that they'd won a contract on HS2, they'd won a big Ministry of Defence contract and a contract in the school services, open brackets, everything's okay, close brackets. So people knew they gave false information to the stock exchange. People knew they gave false information to people knew they gave false information to the workforce. So, many years ago, I was a social worker in Glasgow. If you went up before the beak for a second time, having stolen 100 weight of lead off some sort of roof, you're going down, you're going to Boston. You're in the jail. I mean, it's just unbelievable that nothing happens.
And on that point,
finally, the Carillion directors, let's say, are now facing disqualification because the insolvency service at the 11th hour, well, actually 2 days before the deadline, put papers in court to say that they had failed in the fulfilment of their duties as directors. But they've already indicated in what came before that there won't be financial penalties involved in that. It'll be a slap on the wrist. So the administrative structure is enormously weak in terms of what is actually done about calling people to account when they break the law. And I, therefore, to the question raised, think it would make a big difference if directors guilty of malfeasance were held to account in the courts. I definitely do think that would make a difference.
So why are people so very reluctant when there's a corporate governance code, there's all kinds of codes of ethics, codes of professional behaviour, and when those are breached with the consequences that we have, although the amount of money shouldn't matter because it is the principle of the breach, why are people so reluctant to make an example and therefore start to change the culture?
I think there's a basic problem, though, Amanda, out there really is that people do what they do very often because they know that they can get away with it. And therefore, and they can get away with it because there's nobody looking over their shoulder. So when it comes to issues around governance accountability, for example, well, people know that if they get it wrong, nothing of consequence is going to happen. So it's a far more fundamental issue, this is. And I think you've got to start with that concept and then work that through how you're going to then apply that to whatever policy making or decision making process you're talking about. So when it comes, for example, to accountability, to governance in construction or infrastructure, then who is going to have oversight? What you don't want is 3 or 4 or 5, as we have it now, different organizations, governmental organizations, one sort or another, involved in to a greater or lesser extent in the governance of infrastructure. There's just too many, and they step on each other's toes, they guard each other's patches. So that, I think, is really the end we have to look at. Yes, I agree, penalties, even imprisonment, appropriate. It's interesting, if you look at legislation that's been passed in Queensland last year, Queensland passed legislation to mandate the use of project bank accounts, which Bob referred to earlier. That will be for all of construction, public and private sector in Queensland from July 2022. When you look at the bill, when it was, and the Act now, of course, as it was passed, each section of that Act has a number of penalty points. So if you breach this section, then you've got 50 penalty points. You breach that section, you get 100. Now, at the end, you have to add this all up, and all those penalty points then translate into fines and even possible imprisonment. This is just on the Project Mancat thing. Now, Queensland is part of the common law area. It shares the same values as we do, but they believe you've got to go to these lengths if you've got to change anything. And I think we've got to prepare to go to those sorts of lengths, having this oversight, effective oversight, so that people know somebody's looking over their shoulder. And secondly, that when they do transgress, then they're in real trouble, because it's not just a matter of cash, it could be a matter of liberty as well.
There's a point that arose, or a thought that I had whilst you were talking there, which is in the same way as in construction, risk has been pushed down the supply chain. Where this becomes another risk, i.e., a risk of being held to account, or the management of the contracts and relationships. Do you think that an increase in regulation or even legislation at that level would end up being pushed down in terms of paperwork and responsibility, pushed down the supply chain in the same way?
Amanda, in the current situation, anything that happens at that level will be pushed down. It always will be, and the reason it will be pushed down is simply because the larger companies that tend to dominate construction will always do that, because they're not in the position to absorb risk. They don't have the balance sheets that allow for that. Of course, Carillion, as we know, never did. But what I would say is that if we were to move away from the way we procure and deliver construction, so that we are doing it fundamentally, we are doing it in a truly collaborative way, then a collaborative approach to decide how we're going to address this together as a team would of course be the right way. But if we continue as we are, yes, I mean everything will be passed down.
Oh,
I mean, this takes us into the harder or the more significant, important field of the chomocracy, of how the structure of Britain, as The Economist says, is now run by a chomocracy which looks after everybody that's in the chomocracy. I mean, there is a current corker on the go where many years ago, after the Great Bank collapse, the government set up the Assets Protection Authority, which was to do something about guaranteeing the bank's bad debts, but also, importantly, about forcing or persuading, wrong word there, persuading, we'll say, the bank to do something about bringing in the bad debt. Now, who designed the structure of the Assets Project Authority? It's a chap called Andrew Bailey. Now, Andrew Bailey was the chief executive of the Finance Conduct Authority, and he was responsible for overseeing what had happened with RBS, what happened within RBS about the creation of its global restructuring group, as it was called, which ruined 16,000 businesses, which Clive Lewis in the House of Commons said was the greatest bank theft in human history. And it did so by bankrupting clients and seizing their assets. And what did Andrew Bailey do at the point when the report of the investigation of RBS came before us? Well, first, he delayed the report for 2 years. When Parliament forced him to publish it, he decided to make the final recommendation that there was no grounds for any action against the directors of RBS who had run the GRG asset stripping group. None of the directors, none of those involved. He had no powers whatsoever to take any action. And now Andrew Bailey is the governor of the Bank of England. As Terry Wogan would say, is it me?
Okay, well, I'm very conscious that we have sneaked quite a bit of time. We have lost only a few people. We've still got a number on. But I suspect it probably is quite a good time for just one last question. Has anybody got one question that they would like to? Okay. Let me just make sure I'm looking. Anybody at all? No? Yes, Richard Bakefield. Oh, if you unmute, I'll spotlight you. There you are.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Bob and Rudi. Just picking on that very last question or comment around vesting power in individuals who then maintain the chumocracy. I think the challenge is, who would we have confidence in acting as a regulator? I think it would be much too hard a role for an individual. So how would you appoint them? Maybe it's a discussion for another time, but I'd like your immediate thoughts, Rudi and Bob, please.
If I jump in, yes, you have to have somebody of obviously stature, somebody who, if we're talking about, let's say, a public sector regulator, somebody who has stats experience and not necessarily construction, but certainly a industry heavyweight. And we've had a few of those over the years, some very capable people. I think, but just as important is the fact that it needs to be resourced. When they appointed the gross code adjudicator, for example, Christine Tacken was the adjudicator. She was complaining bitterly because she hardly had any people to help her carry out the investigation into these big supermarkets. So unless you've got a solid breadth of resource and depth of resource to support a regulator, then the regulator is not going to be in a position to make much of impact. But having said that, all the regulator will need to do is, let's say, in one or two projects, identify a problem, put that problem right, either at the beginning or at the outset of that project, and then people then start to listen and take notice. But as far as people is concerned, Richard, I think we've got out there a lot of very capable people. I always thought, for example, somebody who I did work with a few years ago, Sir John Egan. A lot of people didn't like him, but I thought as somebody who drove things, made things happen, he was excellent.
Oh.
Well, it's interesting the points that Rudi raised earlier about Australia, because Australia has an anti-corruption commission, or two of the states have. And by all intents and to all reports, they are now systematically going about their business. Australia had a royal commission on its finance industry. It reported inside a year and libelled the banks with all sorts of false sales of policies, bankrupting their own clients, false advice, to the extent that several of the chairs and chief executives resigned within a 3-month period of the major banks in Australia when the Commission reported. I think it was the year before last, towards the end of 2019. So given all the breadth of problems that we've discussed today, there may be a case for a Royal Commission on Construction, in my view, which would also embrace the financing of the industry and the issuing of government contracts, because I think it's serious enough. Well, it seems to me that serial failure of all the major contracts that we are putting into the public domain cannot go on forever. So from that point of view, in the regulatory area, maybe it is time to have a completely new start, investigate all the problems that there are, and make recommendations of what needs to be done. But to give that some sort of official regulatory power in the sense of making changes to the law when those sort of things are identified. I suppose that's what I'm saying, although I have to say in conclusion that I'm not over-optimistic that the current political structure is in any way interested in that sort of remediation.
And Rudi, your final words on this? Do you think there's appetite for change?
I think there is, but as Chairman Mao said, you know, change comes about through the efforts of a small group of people, activists, and I think that there's always hope when you have, you know, us as CIG services, when you have activists out there who are of a similar mind. We all have a similar mind. Whilst we are here and applying pressure, then I think there's always hope for change. And thank goodness we're not going to, frankly, get change through the industry trade bodies. I mean, I was a chief executive of a trade body myself. We did change. We did manage to change, but it took a lot of effort. We weren't always supported. But I think that would be my view. As long as we've got people like around us who are supportive of change. And by the way, Bob's idea of a Royal Commission, something of that order, I think is absolutely appropriate. But we've got to actually, I think, get into campaigning mode, lobbying mode to bring these things about.
So final word, gentlemen, as briefly as you can before I wrap up. How painful does it have to be before you think something really will change?
Is that Bob? Bob, go first.
Bob, you go first.
I'll go first then. Well, Rudy's quoting Chairman Mao. Lord Carnarvon, from many years ago, issued the important statement at one time about the dogs may bark, but the caravan marches on. And I'm afraid that, to me, it looks as if the dogs may bark, but the caravan in the meantime is marching on. But as Rudi said, there is here collectively a group of people who want to get something done. There is the case study of Carillion that people can use if they buy the book and get everybody else to buy the book. There is, in that context, the hope of change. But I think we have to be, in a certain sense, cognizance of the difficulties that confront us currently. And the final thing I would say is, we need the top of a big construction company to come out, tell the truth, and say what needs to be done.
Rudi, final few words before.
As Bob mentioned earlier, I was a part of the Latham Review over 1993, 1994. This was the result. This was a joint industry government inquiry, and the reason it took place, it was a result of lobbying from within the industry, but the reason it took place was at the beginning of the 90s, after the recession, the end of the 80s recession, beginning of the 90s, there was absolute anarchy in the industry, total anarchy with people going bust left, right, and centre. Insolvencies were extraordinarily high. That was the context. And everybody, when the Latham report came out, everybody agreed, whatever their own personal issues were, to rally around the recommendations and get on with legislation. Well, the legislation was not ever guaranteed, but the legislation of Construction Act is probably one of the most single initiatives that have made a significant difference to the industry. But a lot more to be done. The Grenfell tragedy, unfortunately, of course, brought about the building safety legislation. I hope we don't have to wait for another tragedy. I just think that rather than waiting for something to happen, we have to make it happen, but we have to get some good stats, the kind of stats that Bob was referring to about the failure by and large of public sector projects to deliver to expectation. 3 out of 125, 3 out of 225, I think Bob mentioned, delivering according to expectation. Really, that just simply isn't good enough. So we've got to get to the ear and the right ears of government to press the case, but we've got to press the case.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure we could go on much longer, but I feel obliged to bring the session to a close. I would like to thank you both for all the preparation that you put in to putting your thoughts together and in setting out your particular points of view. I've had lots of extremely complimentary comments from people who've left early, saying how much they've enjoyed it. Insightful, a great way to spend 90 minutes, insightful discussion. We'll certainly be buying the book, Bob, so at least your plugs have worked at least once, right? At least once. And to everybody who is on the call still, I'd like to thank you. And to my colleagues, we've still got Charles online. We've got, who else have we got? I think Richard is still there. Yes, there you are, Richard. So thank you all, because, we do try and put together something that we think will be, and Richard Winston, I can see you there too. We do try to put something together which will be a bit provocative. We may not have the answers, but we think we do have the people who've got a little bit more than just a sniff of an idea of how to do some very productive work in an industry that quite clearly all of us love, despite its ghastly flaws. Maybe the revolution needs to start from the bottom, hey, Bob?
Yeah, they all do.
So, is there anything at all before I bid you a final farewell? Charles, did you want to say anything? Or are you okay with it so far? Always look to you.
I'd just like to thank everybody for participating. It's a very interesting discussion. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Rudy. It was really good. It seemed to me we touched on, really delved into two areas. One was the governance of the industry itself, and the other is the governance of procurement by the government. And they're interrelated, but they both need addressing in their own ways, I think. And at CIG, we will keep pushing on, putting the pressure on.
And on that note, if I may add, Charles, we did, CIG Services did put in a response to the Cabinet Office Green Paper on procurement, which I think was due on the 10th of March, but we have made a response to that. And I believe Rudy, you made a separate and individual response. So there is some consultation going on at the moment. Seems to leverage and get to the right ears to make sure that actually, something comes of that. Because at the end of the day, and here's my point of view, construction is the lifeblood of our economy. And the jobs it provides, the infrastructure, the public services, that it just is the lifeblood of the economy. So when we see things that are so seriously wrong what we're saying is it's okay. It's okay. Sorry, that's my doorbell. It's okay to let the patient rot. So on that note, I thank you all very much for your time, for extending your time, for your lovely comments, and look forward to seeing you on the next masterclass, which will be on collaboration and dispute resolution. And I will be swapping my role from host to presenter in the next masterclass. Details of that. Sorry about that. I forgot to take the battery.
Calls, Amanda, you better get to the door.
I know, it's Nick the postie, and he just wants to show me his knees. That's all. Right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Very much indeed.
Thanks to everyone.